In the summer of 1575, beneath the scorching sun of Mikawa province, a fortress stood on the edge of annihilation. Nagashino Castle, perched like a stone sentinel above the rushing waters where two rivers converged, housed just 500 desperate souls. Outside its wooden walls, a sea of red-armored warriors stretched beyond counting. 15,000 of Japan's most feared cavalry had come to crush this tiny stronghold, and with it, the dreams of those who dared stand against the legendary Takeda clan. But this was no ordinary siege. Hidden within those castle walls was a weapon that would shatter centuries of samurai tradition, a technology so revolutionary that it would rewrite the very nature of warfare itself. What unfolded in those fateful days would become the most decisive battle of Japan's chaotic Sengoku period, where honor met innovation, where the old ways collided with the unstoppable march of progress. This is the story of courage beyond measure, of sacrifice that echoes through the ages, and of the moment when 600 defenders changed the course of Japanese history forever. The clash at Nagashino would prove that sometimes the greatest victories come not from superior numbers or legendary skill, but from the unbreakable will to stand firm when all hope seems lost. To understand the magnitude of what transpired at Nagashino, we must first journey back to an era when Japan bled from countless wounds. The Sengoku period, the age of warring states, had torn the island nation into a patchwork of competing domains. For over a century, feudal lords had battled relentlessly for supremacy, their ambitions leaving villages in ash and fields soaked with blood. It was a time when survival depended not on mercy or diplomacy, but on the strength of one's sword and the loyalty of one's warriors. Among the most formidable of these warlords stood the Takeda clan of Kai province. Their very name struck terror into the hearts of enemies across Japan. Under the brilliant leadership of Takeda Shingen, known as the Tiger of Kai, they had forged an army unlike any the world had seen. These were not mere mounted warriors, but a disciplined cavalry force that moved with the precision of a deadly machine. Shingen had revolutionized warfare itself. While other armies still relied heavily on foot soldiers and archers, he transformed his samurai from bow-wielding horsemen into lance-bearing cavalry. The sight of his red-armored riders thundering across the battlefield, their long spears leveled like the quills of some monstrous beast, had broken the will of countless foes before contact was even made. They called his force the Kiba Gundan, the mounted army, and for good reason. The Battle of Mikatagahara had cemented their legend. There, Shingen's cavalry had crushed a force led by none other than Tokugawa Ieyasu, the future shogun himself. The young Ieyasu had barely escaped with his life, his army scattered like leaves before the Takeda storm. That victory had sent shockwaves through Japan, establishing the Takeda as the supreme military power of their age. But legends, like men, are mortal. In 1573, Takeda Shingen fell ill and died, leaving behind an empire built on conquest and a son burning with ambition. Takeda Katsuyori was no mere shadow of his father. He possessed the same fierce determination, the same hunger for glory that had driven the Takeda to greatness. Yet where Shingen had been patient and calculating, Katsuyori was impetuous, eager to prove himself worthy of his father's legacy. The opportunity came in the form of Mikawa province, the domain of Tokugawa Ieyasu. This region, with its strategic mountain passes and fertile valleys, represented the key to expanding Takeda power eastward. If Katsuyori could crush the Tokugawa forces and claim Mikawa, he would not only avenge his father's unfinished business but also position himself for an assault on the capital itself. Standing in his way was an unlikely alliance. Tokugawa Ieyasu, still smarting from his humiliation at Mikatagahara, had forged a pact with one of Japan's most ambitious and ruthless leaders, Oda Nobunaga. Known as the Demon King for his willingness to employ any means necessary to achieve victory, Nobunaga was already well on his way to unifying Japan under his iron fist. The alliance between these two formidable warlords represented a threat that even the mighty Takeda could not ignore. In June of 1575, as the summer heat shimmered across the mountain valleys of Mikawa, Katsuyori made his move. Leading 15,000 of his finest warriors, including the elite cavalry that had made his father's name legendary, he struck deep into Tokugawa territory. His target was not some distant stronghold or wealthy town, but a modest fortress that controlled the vital transportation routes through the region. Nagashino Castle sat like a chess piece, positioned to command the entire board. Built on a natural promontory where the Onagawa and Takigawa rivers merged to form the mighty Toyokawa, it commanded the only practical routes through the mountainous terrain. The fortress itself was not imposing by the standards of the great castles of Japan. Its wooden structures and stone walls enclosed an area roughly the size of a few city blocks, but its position made it worth more than its weight in gold. The castle's garrison numbered just 500 souls, a mix of samurai, ashigaru foot soldiers, and support personnel under the command of Okudaira Sadamasa, a loyal retainer of the Tokugawa clan. These men knew full well what they faced. The red tide of Takeda cavalry that appeared on the horizon was 30 times their number, led by commanders whose names were whispered with fear across Japan. Yet the defenders possessed advantages that numbers alone could not overcome. Within the castle's armory lay 200 of the most revolutionary weapons ever to reach Japanese shores, Portuguese matchlock firearms that had arrived with European traders just decades earlier. These were not the crude early versions that had first appeared, but refined weapons crafted by Japanese smiths who had perfected the foreign technology. Alongside them sat a single cannon, a bronze beast capable of hurling iron death across impossible distances. The siege began with the methodical efficiency that marked all Takeda operations. Katsuyori positioned his forces to command the western and northern approaches, the only directions from which the castle could be effectively attacked. The eastern and southern faces were protected by steep cliffs that dropped away to the rushing rivers below, natural barriers that made assault impossible. But the Takeda were not content to simply starve out the defenders. Wave after wave of red-armored warriors hurled themselves against the castle's defenses, their war cries echoing off the valley walls. They attempted river crossings under cover of darkness, tried to undermine the walls with siege tunnels, and launched frontal assaults that turned the ground before the gates into a charnel house. The defenders fought with the desperation of men who knew their cause was righteous and their position desperate. The matchlock guns spoke with voices of thunder, each shot capable of punching through the finest armor at close range. The cannon bellowed its defiance across the valley, sending iron balls crashing through the ranks of attackers. Yet for every Takeda warrior who fell, 2 more seemed to take his place. Days stretched into a week as the siege intensified. The castle's food supplies dwindled, and the constant attacks left the garrison exhausted and bloodied. It became clear that without relief, Nagashino would fall, and with it, the strategic balance of the entire region. The fate of the Tokugawa alliance, perhaps of Japan itself, hung in the balance as the red banners of the Takeda closed ever tighter around the beleaguered fortress. In this moment of ultimate crisis, when hope seemed as distant as the mountains on the horizon, a single man would step forward to change the course of history. His name was Torii Suneemon, and his rank was so lowly that many samurai would not have acknowledged his existence. Yet this humble ashigaru foot soldier was about to undertake a mission that would inspire generations and light the fuse for one of the most revolutionary battles ever fought on Japanese soil. As darkness fell over the besieged fortress on the 7th night, the sound of battle gave way to an eerie quiet, broken only by the distant murmur of enemy campfires. Within Nagashino's battered walls, the defenders huddled in exhausted silence, their weapons cleaned and ready, their eyes hollow with the weight of impending doom. The Takeda noose had tightened with each passing hour, and every man knew that dawn might bring their final stand. It was then that Torii Suneemon approached his commander with a proposal so audacious, so fraught with peril, that it bordered on madness. The young ashigaru, barely 20 years old and possessing neither noble blood nor distinguished lineage, volunteered for a mission that seasoned samurai would have considered suicide. He would slip through the Takeda lines, cross 35 kilometers of enemy-controlled territory, and reach Tokugawa Ieyasu's stronghold at Okazaki Castle to plead for immediate relief. The plan was desperate in its simplicity and terrifying in its execution. Suneemon would have to swim the frigid river that formed the castle's natural moat, evade thousands of enemy sentries, and navigate treacherous mountain paths in complete darkness. Even if he succeeded in reaching Okazaki, there was no guarantee that help would arrive in time. Yet as the young soldier knelt before his lord, his voice steady despite the magnitude of his undertaking, every man present understood that this might be their only hope. Under the cover of a moonless night, Suneemon shed his armor and weapons, keeping only a small tanto dagger and a scroll bearing the castle's desperate plea for aid. He slipped into the icy waters of the moat, the current threatening to sweep him away as he fought to reach the opposite bank. Behind him, the castle's walls rose like shadows against the star-filled sky, while ahead lay a gauntlet of enemy patrols and certain death if discovered. The Takeda had positioned their forces with the precision of master strategists. Campfires dotted the landscape like fallen stars, each one representing a cluster of warriors ready to raise the alarm at the first sign of movement. Suneemon moved like a ghost through this deadly maze, his bare feet finding purchase on rocky slopes, his breathing controlled to silence despite the hammering of his heart. Every shadow might conceal an enemy's spear. Every sound could herald his discovery and execution. Hours passed like days as he climbed through the mountain passes, following paths known only to local hunters and smugglers. The terrain was treacherous, with loose rocks that could send a man tumbling into the void and narrow ledges that required the balance of a mountain cat. Yet Suneemon pressed on, driven by the knowledge that 500 lives hung in the balance with every step he took. As dawn broke over the eastern peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the exhausted messenger finally glimpsed the familiar banners of Tokugawa forces in the distance. Okazaki Castle stood proud and strong, its towers reaching toward the heavens like prayers made manifest, but Suneemon's ordeal was far from over. He still had to convince the guards of his identity and purpose, then gain an audience with lords who might dismiss his plea as the ravings of a desperate fool. Fortune smiled upon the brave messenger, as he was quickly brought before Tokugawa Ieyasu himself. The future shogun, still bearing the psychological scars of his defeat at Mikatagahara, listened intently as Suneemon delivered his desperate message. The young soldier spoke with the eloquence of desperation, painting a vivid picture of Nagashino's plight and the strategic importance of its preservation. What happened next would alter the course of Japanese history. Ieyasu, recognizing both the opportunity and the necessity, immediately dispatched messengers to his powerful ally, Oda Nobunaga. The Demon King's response was swift and decisive. Within hours, orders went out across his domain, calling his massive army to prepare for an unprecedented campaign. This would not be a mere relief expedition, but a full-scale confrontation with the legendary Takeda Cavalry. Meanwhile, Suneemon faced a choice that would define his legacy forever. Having delivered his message and secured the promise of aid, the logical course would have been to remain safely at Okazaki until the relief force departed. Instead, the young warrior chose to return to Nagashino, determined to bring word of the approaching salvation to his comrades, still trapped within the castle walls. The return journey proved even more perilous than his initial escape. The Takeda forces, now aware that someone had slipped through their lines, had doubled their patrols and increased their vigilance. Every approach to the castle was watched, every possible route of entry guarded by alert sentries. Yet Suneemon pressed forward, driven by a loyalty that transcended personal survival. His capture was inevitable. On the morning of his attempted return, Takeda scouts spotted the lone figure attempting to reach the castle gates. Surrounded and overwhelmed, Suneemon found himself dragged before Katsuyori himself, the young Takeda lord, whose ambitions had brought this conflict to its climax. Katsuyori was no fool. He recognized immediately the significance of this humble soldier's presence and the implications of his desperate mission. If word had indeed reached the Tokugawa forces, if relief was truly coming, then the entire strategic situation would shift dramatically. The Takeda commander saw an opportunity to turn this setback to his advantage, to break the defenders' morale with a single, devastating blow. The proposal was as cruel as it was clever. Suneemon would be spared, even rewarded, if he would approach the castle walls and shout to the defenders that no help was coming, that they had been abandoned to their fate. The psychological impact would be devastating, potentially causing the garrison to surrender without further bloodshed. All the young soldier had to do was lie to his comrades, betray their trust, and save his own life in the process. What followed became one of the most celebrated acts of loyalty in Japanese history. As Takeda warriors positioned Suneemon within shouting distance of the castle walls, hundreds of defenders gathered along the battlements to hear his words. The silence was absolute, as the young messenger took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would be his last. Instead of the lie his captors expected, Suneemon's voice rang out clear and strong across the valley. He told his comrades that help was indeed coming, that Ieyasu and Nobunaga were marching to their aid, that they must hold fast just a little longer. The words had barely left his lips when Takeda's spears found their mark, but the message had been delivered. The defenders erupted in cheers, their spirits soaring with renewed hope, while their enemies looked on in stunned admiration for such unwavering loyalty. The young ashigaru's sacrifice had accomplished far more than merely maintaining morale. His heroic death had become a rallying cry, a symbol of resistance that would inspire the defenders through the desperate hours to come. Even among the Takeda ranks, warriors spoke in hushed tones of the foot soldier who had chosen honor over life, loyalty over survival. As news of the incident spread through both armies, the psychological landscape of the siege began to shift. The Takeda forces, for all their martial prowess and legendary discipline, found themselves facing an enemy whose resolve had been hardened to diamond by witnessing such extraordinary courage. The defenders of Nagashino, inspired by Suneemon's example, prepared to sell their lives as dearly as possible, but the true test was yet to come. Even as the castle's garrison steeled themselves for the final assault, a massive army was already on the march. Oda Nobunaga had mobilized 30,000 of his finest troops, while Tokugawa Ieyasu gathered 8,000 more. This combined force represented one of the largest armies ever assembled in Japan, a host capable of challenging even the legendary Takeda Cavalry on equal terms. Yet numbers alone would not determine the outcome of the coming battle. Hidden within the ranks of Nobunaga's army was a weapon that would revolutionize warfare not just in Japan but across the world. 3,000 matchlock firearms, crafted by master smiths who had perfected the Portuguese technology, waited to speak with voices of thunder and flame. The morning of June 28, 1575, dawned with a tension that seemed to electrify the very air above Shitaragahara Plain. Across the rolling hills and verdant rice paddies, two of the most formidable armies Japan had ever assembled faced each other in a confrontation that would echo through the centuries. The allied banner of Oda and Tokugawa flew proudly above 38,000 warriors, while the crimson standards of the Takeda marked the positions of 15,000 of the most feared cavalry in the world. Oda Nobunaga had not come to fight a conventional battle. The Demon King understood that facing the legendary Takeda cavalry in open combat would be suicide, no matter how many men he commanded. Instead, he had chosen his ground with the calculating precision of a master strategist, positioning his forces in a natural depression that concealed their true numbers, while maximizing the advantages of his revolutionary weapons. The sight that greeted the Allied army as they took their positions was both magnificent and terrifying. Stretching across the western approaches to Nagashino, Katsuyori's forces presented a tapestry of martial splendor that spoke of centuries of military tradition. The famous red armor of the Takeda cavalry gleamed like fresh blood in the morning sun, while their long lances formed a forest of steel points that seemed to pierce the sky itself. At the heart of this fearsome host rode the 24 generals of Takeda Shingen, legendary commanders whose names were whispered with awe throughout Japan. Yamagata Masakage, master of the cavalry charge and hero of a dozen campaigns. Baba Nobuharu, the old fox whose tactical brilliance had won victories against impossible odds. Naito Masatoyo, whose loyalty to the Takeda cause was matched only by his skill with the spear. These were men who had ridden with Shingen himself, veterans of countless battles who had never known defeat. Yet as imposing as this array of martial power appeared, Nobunaga's forces were preparing something unprecedented in Japanese warfare. Hidden behind hastily constructed wooden palisades, 3,000 ashigaru foot soldiers knelt with matchlock firearms in their hands. These were not the crude weapons that had first arrived with Portuguese traders, but refined instruments of death crafted by Japanese smiths who had surpassed their European teachers in both quality and quantity of production. The defensive line stretched for nearly 2 kilometers along the western edge of the valley, a barrier of sharpened stakes and earthworks that transformed the natural terrain into a killing ground. The small Rengo River wound through the middle of the battlefield, its banks lined with flooded rice paddies that would turn the ground into a treacherous quagmire for charging cavalry. Each Oda soldier had carried with him a long wooden stake during the march to Nagashino, and these simple implements had been transformed into a formidable obstacle. The palisade they created was not merely a physical barrier, but a psychological one as well. Behind its protection, common foot soldiers could stand against the flower of samurai nobility, matchlock guns making peasants the equal of princes in the democracy of death. Katsuyori surveyed the allied position from his command post on the heights above the plain. The young Takeda lord was no fool, despite his reputation for impetuosity. He could see the defensive preparations, recognize the threat posed by the firearms, understand that this would not be the swift cavalry charge that had brought his father so much glory. Yet he also knew that retreat was impossible. His forces were committed, his reputation at stake, his father's legacy hanging in the balance. The pressure to attack came not just from strategic necessity, but from the very nature of the Takeda military system. These were warriors bred for aggression, cavalry trained to charge at the first opportunity, generals whose entire tactical doctrine revolved around the devastating impact of mounted assault. To withdraw without battle would be to admit that the age of the Takeda was ending, that new technologies and tactics had rendered their way of war obsolete. As the morning mist began to burn away under the climbing sun, the first probing attacks commenced. Small groups of Takeda cavalry tested the Allied defenses, seeking weak points in the palisade, attempting to draw the ashigaru into premature volleys that would leave them vulnerable during the long reload time. The sound of sporadic gunfire echoed across the valley as defenders replied to these feints with disciplined restraint. Nobunaga had drilled his musketeers relentlessly in the art of volley fire, a technique that transformed individual weapons into instruments of mass destruction. Rather than allowing each soldier to fire at will, the 3,000 firearms were organized into rotating groups of 1,000 each. As the first rank discharged their weapons, the second rank would step forward, while the third prepared to reload. This continuous cycle of fire would theoretically provide unbroken volleys against any assault. The reality of battle, however, proved more complex than theory suggested. The matchlock firearms of the era were temperamental weapons, prone to misfires in damp conditions and requiring careful maintenance of their firing mechanisms. Each gun took at least 45 seconds to reload under ideal circumstances, and battlefield conditions were far from ideal. Smoke from the black powder charges obscured vision, while the stress of combat made hands shake and fingers fumble with the delicate process of priming and loading. Yet as the morning wore on and the Takeda probes intensified, it became clear that something revolutionary was taking place on the field of Nagashino. The traditional advantage of mounted warriors over infantry was being systematically negated by the combination of defensive terrain and coordinated firepower. Horses that had charged fearlessly into sword-wielding formations balked at the thunder and lightning of massed gunfire, while riders found their armor inadequate protection against the penetrating power of lead bullets at close range. The psychological impact was as significant as the physical damage. The Takeda cavalry had built their reputation on the terror they inspired. The sight of their crimson ranks thundering across the battlefield, with lances leveled and war cries echoing. Now they faced an enemy that did not break and run at their approach, defenders who remained hidden behind their barriers until the last possible moment before unleashing devastating volleys at point-blank range. Katsuyori realized that half measures would not suffice against such tactics. If the defensive line was to be broken, it would require a full-scale assault by his finest troops, a charge that would either shatter the Allied army or destroy his own forces in the attempt. The moment had come to commit everything to a single, decisive throw of the dice. The order rippled through the Takeda ranks like wildfire. Horns sounded across the valley as 15,000 warriors began to form their battle lines. The famous Red Cavalry took position in the center, their lances gleaming like a forest of deadly thorns. On the flanks, ashigaru foot soldiers and mounted arquebusiers prepared to support the main assault. Behind them all, Katsuyori himself took his place, ready to lead from the front in the tradition of his legendary father. The defenders watched this martial pageantry with a mixture of awe and terror. Even veteran warriors could not help but be impressed by the sight of so many mounted samurai arrayed for battle, their colorful banners snapping in the wind, their armor catching the sun like scattered jewels. This was the flower of Japanese military tradition, the culmination of centuries of warrior culture, preparing to crash against the future in a collision that would determine the fate of a nation. The thunder of matchlocks at Nagashino marked more than the end of a siege or the defeat of a legendary army. It signaled the death of an era and the birth of a new Japan where technology would triumph over tradition, where common soldiers could humble the mightiest samurai. The brave defenders who held those walls, inspired by Torii Suneemon's ultimate sacrifice, had witnessed the future of warfare itself. In choosing courage over surrender, innovation over convention, they forever changed the course of a nation's destiny.